thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's also a pleasure, I think, to see the evolution of these summit meetings to be, I guess, a bit more dynamic and inclusive. I'm often that person that sits in the room and is left at the end of the agenda because I have ethics in my title. So I also am really enjoying the mix and the interplay between the science and the patient perspective and the ethics. So I'd like to congratulate the planning committee because I think that's been done exceptionally well. As Michelle said, I'm going to talk to you about some work that was started just after the last summit. And actually, even though there is good reason why it was started after the last summit, the thinking before the work actually started with the first chief scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. And when she came in, one of her key mandates was really to start thinking about emerging technologies and how different populations across the globe could start to access them. So I sit within the science division, and as a consequence of that, we started a program starting to think about not only the research pipeline of these types of technologies, but also the underlying ethics and governance issues. So we've got a big program, as you heard, on the human genome editing, also looking at other types of technologies, and things like AI is an area of our focus. This committee that I'm going to talk to you about in the work was actually formed by the DG. I am going to focus on somatic, and interestingly, the committee was tasked with somatic, germline and heritable, and obviously we differentiate throughout the work. But we got some sort of feedback when we first started, interesting feedback, like, why are you doing somatic? Like, why are you doing somatic? Governance is okay for somatic. And the committee pushed back really hard, and rightly so, because the greatest potential benefits in this area, so the biggest amount of populations, are likely to come from somatic. That's what we've been talking about. And I think for an organisation like WHO, it's critically important that we look. Also, we'll look that it's not a level playing field in terms of governance and oversight. So critically important that we looked at somatic. So that's why the committee really took that on, and the chief scientist wanted us to take it on. As you can see, that's the mandate that was taken. We didn't do as much on the science, I think, as maybe you would expect, but that will be very fortunate that we were able to piggyback on the work of the Commission. So we took a lot of their findings and recommendations and really embedded that into our work, and really focused, I think, predominantly on the sort of ethical but societal issues around governance. And it's been really interesting to hear us all struggling with ethics and the complexity of ethics in a world view when we're trying to do something at a global level, when we understand that there's so much difference going on between different societies. So how do we square that hole? And I'm gonna speak to a bit about how the committee took on that challenge. I've just worked out, my maths is obviously not as good as most of the scientists in the room, that 1/3 of the committee is in this room at this point in time. So I'm also making that point in case there's some really hard questions that I need to throw back to them on their work. So yeah, this was formed by an open call. You see, it's a very global committee with a mixed discipline. I'm going to whistle-stop through this. This is 2.5 years of work that I'm going to go through quickly. If I don't leave you with the fact that I think that our governance has to be just as dynamic as our science, then I have failed, right? If that's the underlying thought that you are not left with, and how we do that as a community, and I think we all have responsibility. Obviously, organisations like WHO may have more responsibility, but if I don't leave you with that thought, then I have failed in my talk. So what did the committee do? So we started obviously in a face-to-face format standard. We got hit by COVID like everybody else and went online. That, I think, delayed the work. I would argue in some ways it may have been to the committee's benefit, because a lot of the issues the committee were talking about, they started coming up in COVID. Global health justice, access, IP, right? These are not unique issues to human genome editing. So when I think we govern a topic like this, I think we have to govern the specificity of it. So there are obvious areas where we think about just human genome editing in terms of safety, efficacy, those sorts of things. But things like IP, we can't afford to be just thinking about this as a community alone. There's a lot more people thinking about this, and TRIPS agreements. I'm not going to get into the detail because I'm not a patent lawyer, but I think the key take-home message on these types of things is there's a lot going on in the broader outline. And something that came up in the earlier talk, which is actually pertinent at the moment in my department, is clinical trials. We're all talking about the lack of harmonisation and maybe a bit of shopping for doing clinical trials. Sometimes that could be good, sometimes I think it can be unfortunate. But actually, coming on the back of COVID, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the World Health Organization's resolution on clinical trials. Hands up, let's see how good our PR is. Not so good. Okay, so in May 2022, there was a resolution, just so you can memorize it, 75.8, on strengthening. I have to read it out because you can never remember the short version, on strengthening clinical trials to provide high-quality evidence on health interventions and to improve research quality and coordination. They've already had one evidence-gathering exercise. I went back and checked. Do you think anyone, I'm not surprised, from this community responded? No, I think most of the responses at the moment are around epidemic preparedness or infectious disease. It's really important for this community to start engaging in these discussions, because they will help with these issues that we were talking about of harmonisation. And that's something I'm definitely going to take back, and that's something I'm going to follow up with the organisers to see how we can do that. And that will also come back to a point I want to leave this group with, is we can't do everything. We can't do everything in governance. We can't do everything in science. How are we going to prioritise, and what should we prioritise as a community? And I think this is a key issue across all the work, whether it be the science, the governance, the ethics. So I'm going to move quickly through this. A lot of work, as you'll see, a lot of engagement. If we did it now, would I do it differently? Probably. I think the field is evolving fast in terms of engagement. I think we're going to hear a lot about that tomorrow. The two outputs I really want to focus on is the governance framework, because that's obviously relevant to the policy, and the 9 recommendations. I'm not going to talk all about them, but why I'm making this point is I think when the committee, and they can all correct me, when they were deliberating, a lot of the issues, so the governance framework is solidly focused on human genome editing, and rightly so, and the questions that all of us and those responsible for governing should be asking when they're thinking about implementing different types of human genome editing. But there are a lot of these issues that I just explained before that are systemic issues. Whether it be the IP, whether it be the issues around medical tourism, ethics dumping, or even the issue around whistleblowing, which we spent a lot of time on. These are more systemic issues. So the recommendations are really about building those into our future thinking. So this is back to we need to be integrated in our approach to governance. When I talk about governance, I'm talking it in the widest possible sense. Regulation is a critically important component of it. I'm not downplaying that, but I'm acknowledging in some settings they can't regulate for a plethora of reasons, as well as other settings. And also, other organisations have a responsibility in this setting. I would argue research associations, Royal Society, different types of funders have a role to play in setting the norms and the standards. And that's part of the discussion we should be having of what they are. Okay, so the framework. I'm hoping more of you are familiar with the framework than we're familiar with the clinical trials resolution, but I don't dare ask you to put your hand up for... Okay, lots of you. I'm seeing some nods, that's good. Okay, so as I said, this is really intended. It's not intended to be overly prescriptive, and I think that's one of the criticisms that we got, but I think this is a starting point for governance. It's a starting point. It's a starting point to think how you can marry the governance at the global, the regional, the national, and I would say the local level. It's designed to be scalable, it's designed to be practical, and it's designed to work across the globe in different settings. The proof of this is in the pudding, and I'll come to that. This is how it was outlined. This is what we did. I'm going to go through these very quickly. But that's if you're reading through it, it's in a very logical order. Everything has a different focal point. I want to quickly mention this. Piers is actually going to pick up on the work really to understand governance frameworks across the world. Like we say we need good data for science, I'm going to argue you need good data for governance, right? This map will tell you what's on paper. It will tell you maybe what's on paper, and I need to thank Françoise Bayless and colleagues for this work, but the devil's in the detail. A lot of the regulation or oversight in this space may not even have human genome editing in the title. It may be in a different piece of regulation and legislation. There may be, as we were saying, a whole bunch of ethics regulation or oversight, a whole bunch of, so it's really important, I think, to gather the evidence, and I think that's where Piers' talk will come in. You can see that there's a lot of difference in the landscape, but we need to understand why that difference. Is that about values? Is that about lack of interest in doing that the governance is different? That's really important, I think, for us as a community to understand. Again, I'm not going to talk about this. Ethical values and principles keep coming up, and we're getting a little stuck on this. I think they're really important. This is the values that the committee came up with after 2 years of engagement and deliberations. You could debate these. For example, when we implement this framework, and I'm going to talk about that shortly, I do not think that the emphasis on these values or principles will be the same in different settings. I think what we need to look for going forward is where the commonality is, or where the differences are. Is there commonality in our values? How does that translate into our governance and our legislation? That's what's really important. Embedding these values in the way that we think. Some of them, I think, procedural ones you'll find now in a lot of documents. All the ones coming out of post-COVID or the COVID initiatives, openness, transparency, and accountability are everywhere in all those documents. So I think some of them we will get some consensus on. We heard from a speaker yesterday that solidarity is rarely used in some settings. It's used in a lot of settings, but I would agree it's not used in all settings. And I would argue it's used very differently now after COVID than maybe it was when we started using this in this map. So things are changing, and we need to understand the changes, and that's why implementation of this type of model is really important. As I said, I think this is a starting point. This is a starting point to think it through, but ask the questions we need to ask. The governance framework goes through a lot of scenarios and gives the questions. We're being quite directive in some senses about the questions you should be thinking about if you have responsibility. You can look at this, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. We look at the instruments and the tools available. And I think part of the mapping, this is really important because certain different audiences or stakeholders should be using different tools. And some may be applicable and right in certain settings. So we go into all these models. And I think part of the mapping and understanding the different governance will see who's what I'm calling up-regulating and down-regulating. So what I would say is in some settings where you know regulation's not brilliant or it's hard to implement, maybe because of budgetary constraints or maybe cultural differences, then you would be thinking, for example, your research ethics guidance maybe need to be stronger, or your funder policy should be, taking account of this kind of difference. The thing that we also thought was critically important to tease out the questions was scenarios. And these are really designed to pull out some of the key governance issues. So throughout the scenarios, there's one on clinical trials for sickle cell, Huntington's, there's one on heritable human genome editing and prenatal in utero somatic, but they bring out issues firstly about regulations. What should you be asking? Do you have regulation in this area? Is it specific? Or do you have biosafety regulation that could cover this? Do you have GMO regulation that shouldn't cover this but might be covering it inadvertently? All these sorts of questions. How inclusive is your process for the development of your regulation or your governance of your oversight mechanisms? What are you thinking about access at the end of this? And that, as we said, this is a really tough question, but if we really are going to be thinking about doing these types of trials and embedding these therapies in different settings, we have to think about access, not at the point of we're panicking because companies are pulling out. We need to think about access much earlier in the process. and think about really innovative models. I think it's great. Part of the answers for this will come from the scientific development, but it won't just be that. It'll be evolutions in governance and the way we think about it. I've mentioned the scenarios. I wanted to quickly mention, I'm running out of time, the recommendations, and I've already said them. I wanted just to give a shout out to the registries one. Big on the transparency. I think what's really interesting with the registries is this is only clinical trials at the moment. I think we need to expand this, and the recommendation is to basic research. I was really interested in the hackers or the do-it-yourself community. In an ideal world, they would be on a registry that would be linked to this registry, so we know what's going on. So I think that's a really interesting model, and there's so much we can learn from the stem cell community in this field, because there are so many, there's not a monitoring at the moment of registries. So a lot of stem cell research that's on there isn't what we would necessarily, not a lot, some, clarify or consider to be bona fide. We'd be worried about it. And I think we've got an opportunity, while the community is still reasonably small, to look at how we can get the transparency and accountability into registries. Okay, second to last slide, you'll be relieved to hear. Reflections. I think we need to transform the thinking we're doing around science into the innovative, creative thinking into our approach to governance. And that's what I'm really interested in. I really liked the comment about transformative ethics. I'm also going to say research ethics committees, critically important, but they come at the end of the line of a long, laborious process. If you have to pick everything up by then after you've gone the whole way through the process, we've got problems. So the ethics should be embedded earlier on in the process, both in the research design, but in the governance design. Consideration of values, I'm arguing, is a critical component of good governance, both in the way you engage audiences, stakeholders, communities, participants, but also in priority setting. So much of what we've been talking about is research priority setting and healthcare priority setting. And interestingly, I'm embarking on a piece of work where we're trying to embed ethics into research priority setting. So not that I need any more work, but this is ripe for a case study, this area on how you look at research, healthcare priority setting. And I'd happily welcome people who want to work on that with me. Again, this is the beginning of the journey. It's not the panacea. I think it's a good mechanism for us to have discussions on what governance should look like. But I think the values in there, the issues around global health justice, I think the references to equity, to trust, those things do take account of access. When we think of governance, it's not regulation. It is about values and thinking about access. Trade-offs. It's what I said earlier. They're trade-offs. We can't do everything. We just can't. We don't have the budget. We don't have the time. We don't have the resource. So as a community, can we think about prioritising, and what is the opportunity cost of doing that? We're prioritising science. Should we be prioritising certain types of governance? Should that be engagement with populations before we make laws? It's a question that I think we have to address. And then finally, the good news. You should always finish on some good news. Is we're actually going to have a go at piloting this framework in Uganda. We were contacted by the Ugandan country office together with the Ministry of Health because they are considering revising their oversight of emerging technologies, and we're cognizant that they needed something quite robust in this area. So they wanted to actually implement the framework. At the same time, and this goes to the conversation we were just happening, they're really interested in progressing sickle cell clinical trials in Uganda, but want the right, robust mechanism for doing that. They also want the pathway, the regulatory pathway towards approval and access. So over next week, the timing could have been better. It could have been last week, and then I could have reported back some findings. We'll be having a 2-day stakeholder meeting, predominantly organised by my colleagues in country, and a shout out to the Ugandan National Council for Science and Technology, who have been fantastic in this space, and my colleagues in the country office. But it's a really interesting and exciting opportunity, I think, to have a go at implementing something that was born on the global level, but looking at the local level. I think critically important, we need to do this implementation in other settings to be able to compare and contrast. And I'll stop there and thank you.